It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning in 2147, though quiet is a strange word to use when your whole world is about to change forever. People were going about their usual routines, farmers tending crops in vertical farms, students logging into virtual classrooms, engineers monitoring deep space probes near Jupiter. No one expected the sky to speak that day, but it did. A signal came, not through radio waves or old-fashioned satellites, but through something far more advanced, something that bypassed every filter and firewall like it wasn't even there. It appeared on every screen on Earth at once: phones, public displays, even the dashboard of electric rickshaws in Mumbai, and cargo haulers in the Arctic. The message wasn't in any human language at first. Just symbols, clean, geometric calm. Within minutes, translation algorithms kicked in and the words began to form. Greetings from the Galactic Conquered. You are not alone. At first, joy erupted. Cheers filled streets. Strangers hugged in Tokyo, Nairobi, Buenos Aires. After centuries of wondering, staring up at the stars and asking, "Is anyone out there?" The answer had finally come, and it sounded peaceful, hopeful even, but that hope didn't last long. Over the next few weeks, more messages arrived. Details emerged. The Galactic Conquered wasn't just one civilization. It was a union of over 200 species, spread across thousands of star systems, all governed by something called the Galactic Senate. They'd been watching Earth for a while, they said, monitoring humanity's progress. And now that humans had finally built ships capable of reaching nearby stars thanks to breakthroughs in fusion, engines, and quantum navigation, they decided it was time to make contact. The first meetings were held in orbit, aboard a neutral station halfway between Earth and the Moon. Human diplomats, scientists, and linguists floated nervously in zero gravity, facing beings unlike anything imagined in old sci-fi movies. Some looked like shimmering clouds of light. Others wore exosuits that hummed with energy. None of them smiled because most didn't have mouths, but their tone, translated through neural interfaces, was polite, formal, distant. Then came the real reason for the visit. During the third session, the lead envoy, a tall, silver-skinned representative from a species called the Velan, delivered what they called a stability directive. In simple terms, Earth had to disarm. Completely. All military spacecraft, orbital defense grids, AI battle systems, even the old nuclear stockpiles buried deep underground. Everything had to be handed over or dismantled. Permanently. The reason? Humanity's history. The envoy played a timeline on the chamber's central display. World War I, World War II, the Cold War, countless regional conflicts, drone strikes, cyber warfare, environmental destruction. It wasn't presented with anger, just cold clinical observation. Your species has shown a consistent pattern of self-destruction and aggression, the envoy said. The Concord cannot risk introducing such volatility into the galactic community. Disarmament is not a request. It is a condition of your inclusion. Silence filled the room. Not the kind of silence that follows a loud noise, but the heavy sinking kind that comes when you realize you're being judged. And found wanting. Back on Earth, the news spread like wildfire. At first, many people agreed. Maybe they're right, some said. Look at what we've done to our own planet. Maybe we don't deserve a seat at the table. Pacifist movements held vigils. Religious leaders called for humility. Even some military officials admitted that humanity's past was stained with violence. But others weren't so willing to accept the verdict. In shipyards orbiting Mars, engineers paused their work on new colony transports and stared at the Senate's ultimatum on their screens. In underground labs beneath the Himalayas, AI researchers debated whether surrendering their defense networks would leave Earth vulnerable, not just to aliens, but to rogue factions within humanity itself. And in coastal cities still recovering from rising sea levels, people asked, who are they to decide our fate? They've never lived through our struggles. They've never rebuilt after a war they didn't start. The real shock came when the Conquered made their position even clearer. A massive vessel, silent, black, shaped like a smooth obsidian teardrop, appeared near Mars. It didn't attack. It didn't broadcast threats, it just hovered, watching, waiting. The message was unspoken but understood. Comply or face consequences. That's when the arguments on Earth turned serious. Not just online debates or news panel shouting matches, but real, urgent conversations in government chambers, community centers, and family kitchens. Should humanity bow to an alien authority to prove it could be trusted? Or was this the moment to stand firm, even if it meant standing alone? Some nations pushed for immediate compliance. Better to be safe than sorry, their leaders said. Others warned that giving up all defenses would make Earth a permanent junior partner, never truly equal, always under supervision. A few even whispered about preparing for war, though no one wanted that, not after everything humanity had already survived. What no one outside a few secure bunkers knew was that Earth had been preparing for this moment, not with weapons, but with something far more human. Decades earlier, after the last major global conflict nearly collapsed civilization, a secret international agreement had been signed. Not to build doomsday devices, but to develop systems that could protect Earth without firing a single shot. It was called Project Aegis, not a weapon, but a shield, and it had been quietly growing ever since. Fed by contributions from every continent, African solar grid algorithms, South American biosensor networks, Scandinavian climate stabilization models, all woven together into a planetary defense philosophy based on resilience, not retaliation, but that was still hidden. For now, as the days passed, tension built. The conquered ship remained near Mars. Earth's orbital stations went into standby mode. Children asked their parents if the aliens were going to take away their homes. Teachers tried to explain diplomacy without sounding afraid. And in the middle of it all, a strange thing happened. People started talking to each other again. Not as citizens of rival nations, but as humans. As Earthlings. Because for the first time, the enemy wasn't another country. It was a judgment from the stars. And that changed everything. No one knew what would happen next. Would Earth surrender its sovereignty to prove it had grown up? Or would it risk everything to show that trust couldn't be demanded? It had to be earned. The Galactic Senate thought they understood humanity. They'd studied the wars, the mistakes, the scars, but they hadn't seen the quiet courage in a farmer replanting trees in a war-torn valley. They hadn't heard the lullabies sung in refugee camps. They hadn't witnessed how again and again people chose to rebuild instead of burn. And that, more than any weapon, was what the Senate was about to discover. After the Galactic Senate's demand echoed across every screen on Earth, the planet didn't just react, it fractured. At first it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then the arguments began. Not the kind you see in news clips with people shouting over each other, but the real, heavy kind, the kind that happens in living rooms and cafes, in late-night messages between old friends who suddenly find themselves on opposite sides of a question no one ever thought they'd have to answer. Should we give up our defenses to prove we're peaceful? Some people said yes, absolutely. They pointed to the ruins still scattered across old battlefields, to the scars left by wars that solved nothing. We've spent centuries hurting each other, they said. Maybe this is our chance to finally grow up. In cities that had once been bombed and rebuilt, in villages that remembered famine and occupation, many believed that surrendering weapons, even to strangers from the stars, was better than risking another war. Peace, they argued, wasn't weakness. It was wisdom, but others weren't so sure. They asked, who gets to decide what peace looks like? If an outsider shows up and says, you're dangerous, so hand over everything that protects you, is that really peace or control? In places where people had fought for generations just to keep their land, their language, their right to exist, the idea of disarming felt like handing over their future to someone who didn't understand their story. The tension didn't just stay in speeches or policy papers. It showed up in everyday life. Families debated over dinner, students argued in school forums, even artists and musicians took sides, some releasing songs about trust and unity, others painting murals of broken chains and watchful eyes in the sky. Governments were just as divided. Nations that had long relied on strong defense programs, those with space stations, orbital shipyards, deep space monitoring networks, warned that giving up everything at once would leave Earth helpless. Not just against the conquered, but against anyone. Because once you show you have no way to defend yourself, you become a target, not a partner. But smaller nations, those without fleets or weapons in space, pushed back. Why should we pay the price for choices we didn't make? They asked. If the big powers built war machines, why should the rest of us suffer the consequences, or lose protection because of it? For weeks, it seemed like Earth might tear itself apart before the aliens even made a move. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of more shouting, people started listening. In a move no one saw coming. The global communications network, usually flooded with ads, entertainment and political noise, was opened for a special broadcast. Not by one country, not by one leader, but by a coalition of ordinary citizens, scientists, teachers, farmers, and engineers from every corner of the planet. They didn't speak for governments. They spoke for themselves, and what they said changed everything. One by one, voices came through, some shaky, some steady, all human. A fisherman from the Philippines talked about how his village rebuilt after the last superstorm, not with weapons, but with shared labor and hope. A teacher from Kenya described how her students, many of them refugees, learned to solve conflicts with words, not fists. A retired engineer from Canada explained how he'd spent his life designing systems to clean polluted rivers, not to destroy cities. None of them denied humanity's past. They didn't pretend wars hadn't happened or that mistakes hadn't been made. But they asked a simple question. If we're only judged by our worst moments, do we ever get a chance to show our best? That broadcast, raw, unpolished, deeply personal, spread faster than any official statement ever had. People cried. People shared it with neighbors. Even the most hardened military advisors admitted it moved them. Because for the first time, the conversation wasn't about weapons or treaties. It was about who humans really were. And that shift in tone gave leaders the courage to do something bold. Within 72 hours, every major nation agreed to an emergency session, not of the old United Nations, which had grown slow and tangled over the decades, but of a newly reformed Earth Council. Representatives from every continent, every culture, every walk of life gathered, not in a grand hall, but in a simple virtual space designed to feel like a circle, not a hierarchy. No flags, no podiums, just voices. For 3 full days they talked. Not to win, not to dominate, but to find a path forward that honored both safety and dignity, and they found it. Instead of saying yes or no to the Senate's demand, Earth offered something new: transparency. They proposed opening all defense systems to joint inspection, not by the Concord alone, but by a team that included neutral species and, crucially, human observers. They suggested creating a shared early warning network that would alert all parties to any threat, anywhere. And most importantly, they insisted that any rules about weapons had to apply to everyone, not just Earth. It was a compromise, yes, but not a surrender. It was a hand extended, not a head bowed. When the message was sent to the Galactic Senate, it wasn't wrapped in threats or grand speeches. It was clear, calm, and firm. "We understand your concerns," it read. "But trust must be mutual. If you ask us to show our hands, you must show yours too." The Senate's reply came quickly and coldly. They called Earth's proposal emotionally driven and logically unsound. They said humanity was unable to grasp galactic realities. And they made it clear the original order stood: disarm, or be treated as a threat. That response hit Earth like a slap. But instead of panic, something else rose up, something quieter, stronger: unity. Because now, no one saw this as just a political problem. It was personal. The Senate hadn't just rejected a policy. They'd dismissed the voices of millions who had spoken from the heart. They'd said, in effect, your pain, your growth, your efforts to be better, they don't matter. And that changed everything. Overnight, the divisions began to fade. Countries that had argued for days started sharing data. Engineers who once worked in secret labs began posting open-source designs for non-lethal defense systems. Artists created symbols of Earth, not as a planet of soldiers, but as a home worth protecting. Even children got involved, sending drawings of Earth with hands holding it gently, not gripping it like a weapon. No one was calling for war. But no one was willing to be erased either. In orbit, shipyards that had slowed down began humming again, not building cannons, but reinforcing shields. Not loading missiles, but installing sensors that could detect danger from light years away. And deep beneath the oceans and mountains, old emergency protocols were updated, not for attack, but for resilience. For survival. For the simple, stubborn will to remain free to choose their own path. The Galactic Senate thought they were dealing with a species still trapped in its violent past, They didn't realize that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in its weapons, but in its ability to come together when it mattered most. And as Earth prepared, not for battle, but for truth, they did something the Senate never expected. They stopped trying to convince the stars they were good. Instead, they decided to show them. While the Galactic Senate watched from their distant chambers, expecting Earth to either surrender or lash out in fear, something far quieter and far more powerful was happening down below. No explosions, no war drums, just the steady hum of human hands at work, minds at peace, and hearts refusing to be broken. Behind closed doors in research labs, underground data vaults, and even repurposed subway tunnels, a long-dormant plan quietly woke up. It wasn't called a weapon. It didn't have a flashy name or a launch code. It was simply known as a Project Aegis. Not because it was meant to strike, but because it was meant to shield, to protect, to endure. The idea had started generations ago, after the last great global crisis nearly pushed civilization over the edge. Back then, the world's brightest minds, scientists, philosophers, engineers, had asked a simple question. What if we built defenses that didn't rely on hurting anyone? Not missiles, not lasers, not AI soldiers, but systems that made violence pointless. Systems that turned Earth not into a fortress, but into something far harder to conquer, a living, thinking, adapting whole. And now, with the Concord's black ship still hovering near Mars like a silent judge, that old dream was finally being put to the test. But here's the thing. Project Aegis wasn't run by generals or politicians. It was built by teachers, farmers, coders, medics, and students. Because Earth's real strength had never been in its weapons. It was in its people. Across continents, ordinary citizens began contributing in ways no one expected. In Southeast Asia, drone operators who once delivered medicine to remote villages reprogrammed their fleets to map orbital debris fields. In South America, communities that had spent decades restoring rainforests shared their ecological monitoring networks, now upgraded to track energy signatures in near-Earth space. In the Arctic, ice researchers adapted their climate models to predict how solar flares could be used to mask satellite movements. No one was building bombs. Instead, they were weaving a web of awareness, resilience, and clever tricks that made Earth harder to threaten, not by fighting back, but by making aggression useless. One of the most brilliant ideas came from a group of teenagers in a coastal city. They'd been working on a school project about light refraction in ocean waves. When they heard about the Concorde ship's sensors, they wondered, what if we could bend light around something like an invisibility cloak but for whole structures? Within weeks, they'd teamed up with university labs and turned their theory into a working prototype. Not perfect, not magic, but enough to scatter radar and confuse targeting systems. And they shared the design freely, online, for anyone to improve. Meanwhile, Earth's orbital infrastructure, once seen as fragile, began to shift. Old cargo tugs used to move supplies between space stations were fitted with magnetic nets and robotic arms. Their new job? Not to attack, but to gently nudge space junk into protective barriers around key satellites. It was like building a shield out of scrap metal and second chances. Even the planet's AI networks, once feared as potential weapons, were repurposed. Instead of calculating strike trajectories, they now coordinated global energy grids, rerouted communications during solar storms, and even helped predict crop failures so food could be sent where it was needed most. The message was clear. Intelligence didn't have to mean destruction. It could mean care. But the most surprising part wasn't the tech. It was the spirit behind it. People weren't working in secret. They weren't hoarding knowledge. They were sharing, openly, generously. A farmer in Kenya posted a video showing how his solar-powered irrigation system could be linked to early warning sensors. A musician in Brazil composed a song using data from Earth's magnetic field, turning invisible forces into something beautiful that millions listened to, not out of fear, but wonder, and all of it, the code, the designs, the lessons was uploaded to a public galactic archive. Not hidden, not encrypted, just there, for the Concorde to see, for anyone to see, because Earth wasn't trying to hide. It was trying to say, this is who we are now. At the same time, something else was spreading, not through wires or satellites, but through stories. As the tension with the Senate grew, people began sharing more than just plans. They shared memories. A grandmother in Greece described how her village fed enemy soldiers during a war, not out of fear, but because hunger has no uniform. A fisherman in Indonesia talked about how his community rebuilt their coral reefs by hand, grain by grain, after the oceans warmed. A librarian in Canada explained how books saved her town's spirit during years of isolation. These weren't grand speeches. They were quiet truths, and they traveled farther than any weapon ever could. The Galactic Senate, used to dealing with species that either submitted or fought, didn't know what to make of it. Their intelligence reports showed no military buildup, just a planet buzzing with activity that looked more like a festival than a war room. Energy use was up, yes, but mostly in schools, labs, and community centers. Communications traffic had surged, but it was filled with music, poetry, and open-source engineering files. One Concord analyst later admitted, "We expected defiance or surrender. We never expected creativity. Back on Earth, no one was celebrating. They knew the real test was coming." The Senate hadn't backed down, and that black ship near Mars hadn't moved, but something had changed in the air. People walked a little taller. They looked at the stars not with fear, but with quiet determination. Because they weren't waiting for a hero to save them, they were the heroes, millions of them, each doing their small part to protect not just their home, but the idea that peace didn't mean powerlessness. And as the days passed, Earth didn't just prepare to defend itself. It prepared to show the galaxy what humanity had learned after centuries of pain, that the strongest shield isn't made of steel or fire. It's made of trust, ingenuity, and the simple, stubborn choice to build instead of break. The day the Concorde fleet moved, Earth didn't panic. There were no sirens, no emergency broadcasts screaming for people to take cover. Instead, something far more unusual happened: silence. Not the silence of fear, but the kind that comes when everyone knows exactly what to do. The Senate had finally lost patience. After weeks of Earth's refusal to disarm, after all the open-source blueprints, the peaceful broadcasts, the quiet unity, they decided to make an example. A fleet of sleek silver enforcer ships detached from the main Concord vessel near Mars and began a slow, deliberate approach toward Earth's primary orbital shipyard, the largest human-made structure in space. Their mission was clear: disable it. Not destroy it, just shut it down. A demonstration of consequence, as their message put it. A reminder that the galaxy had rules and Earth was expected to obey. But as the fleet crossed the threshold of lunar orbit, they found something they didn't expect. No weapons were pointed at them. No warships rose to meet them. Instead, every screen on every Concord vessel, inside cockpits, on command decks, even on personal comms, lit up with the same image. It was Earth, not a map, not a symbol, not a threat, just life. From the frozen lakes of Siberia to the sun-baked plains of the Sahel, from floating cities in the Pacific to underground farms beneath the Andes, cameras, drones, and citizen phones streamed live footage of people doing the most ordinary, beautiful things. Children planting saplings in soil still scarred by old fires, elders teaching young ones how to weave traditional patterns, scientists releasing lab-grown coral onto dying reefs, musicians playing in open squares, their songs blending languages from every continent, a classroom in a refugee settlement where kids were learning alien alphabets, not out of fear but curiosity. And over it all, no voiceover. No demands, just the soft hum of wind, laughter, ocean waves, and the quiet rhythm of a planet choosing to heal. At the same time, something else happened in space. Earth's orbital infrastructure, those old cargo tugs, communication satellites and solar arrays began to move. Not aggressively, not chaotically, but with a kind of graceful coordination. Like dancers in a silent ballet, they formed a wide, shimmering ring around the planet. Not blocking the Concord ships, but surrounding Earth itself in a delicate web of reflective panels and energy collectors. Then, for exactly 37 seconds, the sun dimmed. Not because something exploded, not because of a weapon, but because that web, made of recycled solar sails, emergency shields, and even mirrored debris from old satellites, had gently bent a fraction of the sunlight, creating a soft, temporary shadow over the planet. It wasn't an attack. It was a demonstration. A quiet show of what humanity could do. Not just harness the power of a star, but do it without burning anything down. The message was clear. Though no one said a word, we can control forces you can't even imagine, but we choose not to use them as weapons. On the conquered ships, confusion spread. Officers checked their sensors again and again. Where were the defense grids? The hidden missiles? The AI war mines? All their intelligence had prepared them for resistance, explosions, jamming, counterattacks, but this was something else entirely. Back on Earth, people watched the skies, not with dread, but with calm. They knew what was happening. They'd all agreed to it. Every community, every nation had volunteered their feeds, their time, their trust. This wasn't a performance for the aliens. It was a statement to themselves. This is who we are. This is what we protect. In one small town in the Highlands, a group of teenagers had spent the night calibrating a network of mirrors on rooftops, syncing them with the orbital array. In a coastal village, fishermen paused their work to send live video of sea turtles hatching under moonlight. In a desert research station, engineers monitored the solar dimming, ready to adjust if it risked harming crops below. Everyone had a role. No one was left out. And that was the real power of it. The Galactic Senate had assumed that strength meant force, that security meant control, that peace could be enforced from above. But Earth showed them something different, that true strength comes from connection, that real security grows from trust, and that peace isn't something you demand, it's something you build together every single day. For the first time, the conquered enforcers didn't know what to do. Their orders were clear: disable the shipyard. But how do you enforce against a planet that isn't fighting back, and yet refuses to be broken? One by one, the ship slowed, then stopped. Hovering in the silent dark, caught between duty and doubt, hours passed. The live feeds from Earth continued. A baby took its first steps. A community kitchen served meals to strangers. A group of artists painted a mural on a ruined wall, turning cracks into constellations. None of it was staged. None of it was propaganda. It was just life, fragile, messy, and full of hope. And slowly something shifted, not in Earth's defenses, but in the hearts of those watching from afar. Later, a conquered pilot would describe it like this: "We came to judge a species we thought we understood. But what we saw wasn't a threat. It was a mirror, and in it we saw something we'd forgotten, what it means to care for your home, not because you own it, but because you love it." Back on Earth, no one celebrated. No victory chants. No flags raised. People simply went back to their work, planting more trees, teaching more lessons, building more bridges. Because the point wasn't to win, it was to be seen, truly seen. And in that moment, as the conquered fleet hung motionless in the void, Earth didn't just avoid a war. It changed the rules of the galaxy, without firing a single shot. In the days that followed, the silence from the Concord fleet wasn't empty. It was full of something new. Not commands, not threats, but questions. Quiet, hesitant signals began trickling in from the silver ship still hovering near Earth's orbit. At first they were technical. Requests for data on the solar dimming event, inquiries about the live feeds, even polite questions about the coral restoration projects shown in the Pacific streams. Then came deeper ones. Why did you show us children? What does planting a tree in old war zones mean to you? How do you teach peace without forgetting pain? Earth didn't answer with official statements or polished diplomacy. Instead, people just kept living and kept sharing. A baker in a mountain village posted a video of how she taught her grandchildren to make bread, using grains grown in soil once poisoned by conflict. A group of students in a coastal city sent open-source plans for floating gardens that cleaned ocean water while growing food. An elder in a desert community recorded a story passed down for generations about resolving disputes through shared meals, not weapons. None of it was staged. None of it was meant to impress. It was just life, honest, imperfect, and deeply human, and somehow, that honesty reached further than any treaty ever could. Back in the Galactic Senate's grand chamber, carved from asteroid rock and lit by bioluminescent vines, the mood had shifted. The species that once saw humanity as a reckless child now watched the constant stream of Earth's daily life with something close to wonder. One delegate, representing a civilization that had abandoned physical form centuries ago, admitted they'd forgotten what it felt like to touch soil, to feel rain, to hold a newborn. Another, from a planet with no oceans, stared at footage of waves crashing on a shore and whispered, "We thought peace meant stillness, but yours is alive." Within a week, the Senate called an emergency session, not to issue another decree, but to reconsider everything. The old argument that humanity was too dangerous to trust began to crumble under the weight of what they'd actually seen. Not a planet of soldiers, but a planet of gardeners, teachers, healers, and dreamers. Not a species bent on conquest, but one stubbornly committed to repair. And then came the surprise no one expected. Dozens of smaller civilizations, many of whom had long chafed under the Senate's rigid rules, spoke up in Earth's defense. "You judge them by their past," said a delegate from a water-world species, "but you ignored their present." Another, from a nomadic starfaring culture, added, "They didn't hide their scars. They showed them and then showed how they healed. That takes more courage than any weapon." The pressure grew until the Senate had no choice. The disarmament order was formally withdrawn, not because Earth had won a fight, but because the galaxy had finally seen the truth. Trust isn't given to those who never made mistakes. It's given to those who keep trying to do better. In its place, a new invitation arrived, not as a command, but as a request. The Senate proposed forming a council of co-creation, a group focused not on control but on collaboration, on sharing knowledge, protecting fragile worlds, and solving problems together. And Earth was asked to be a founding member. The response from Earth wasn't a grand announcement. It was a simple message sent from every continent at once. "We accept, but only if the council is built on equality, not hierarchy, on listening, not lecturing." The Senate agreed. Months later, the first joint mission launched, not a warship, but a science vessel carrying botanists, oceanographers, and climate engineers from Earth and 3 other species. Their goal? To help restore a dying moon in a distant system, using Earth's regenerative farming techniques and alien biotech. It was small, quiet, but it was a start. Back home, life returned to its rhythm, but with a new awareness. People still argued, still made mistakes, still faced challenges, but something had changed in how they saw themselves. They weren't just citizens of nations anymore. They were Earthlings. And that meant something now, not just to each other, but to the stars. Years later, when alien diplomats visited for the first time, not as enforcers, but as guests, they didn't go to military bases or government halls. They walked through rewilded forests in Europe, sat in classrooms in Southeast Asia, helped plant mangroves along African coastlines. They didn't come to inspect defenses. They came to learn how a species that once nearly destroyed itself had learned to protect not just its people, but its planet. And in those quiet moments, sharing tea under cherry blossoms, watching fireflies in a restored meadow, listening to children sing songs in a dozen languages, they understood what the Senate had missed all along. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't in what it could destroy. It was in what it could rebuild, in its stubborn refusal to give up on beauty, even after knowing pain, in its quiet courage to choose care over control, every single day. Historians would later write that Earth never fired a shot during the Concorde crisis, that it faced down a galactic power not with weapons but with windows into its soul. And in doing so, it didn't just earn a place among the stars. It reminded the galaxy what peace really looked like, not as the absence of conflict, but as the presence of connection. And as those alien visitors stood on a hill overlooking a valley where wind turbines spun beside ancient olive trees, they didn't speak. They just watched. And for the first time, they weren't judging, they were learning. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to shout or strike, but to simply be who you are openly, honestly, and without fear. And let the world or the galaxy see that you're more than your worst day. Earth had done that. Not perfectly, not loudly, but truly, and in the end that was enough to leave even the stars speechless, not with fear but with awe.